Hello, I'm Andy Alabastro, Director of Coalition Relations at the Heritage Foundation, and I'm pleased to welcome you to Restoring America as the Land of the Free. We welcome those joining us from Resource Bank, the network of our closest friends, allies, and conservative leaders. We're used to convening in person this time of year, but we're pleased to offer these discussions and our expert analysis through the virtual platform. We're also pleased to welcome members of the public. Our public programs team has a full suite of robust programming, and you can always find that at heritage.org/events. This session is being recorded. It will be posted on resourcebank.org within the next 24 hours. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we want your questions, and we encourage you to submit them through the questions tab in the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. We encourage you to identify yourself and your organization so we can say hello when we bring your question to our guests. Now, we're pleased to have with us some special guests today, the Honorable Karen Fann, Clint Woods, Nick Loris, and our moderator, Tim Descher. And as I offer brief introductions, I invite our guests to turn on their cameras. The Honorable Karen Fann is President of the Arizona State Senate. She is the second female Senate President in the history of Arizona. Senator Fann currently serves as Vice Chair of both the Finance Committee and the Transportation and Technology Committee, and is a member of the Natural Resources, Energy, and Water Committee. Senator Fann was first elected in November 2016 and previously serving from 2011 to 2016 as a state representative. Senator Fann is also the owner and CEO of a highway construction company specializing in the installation of guardrail and signs throughout the state of Arizona. Congratulations on that company recently celebrating its 35th business anniversary. Clint Woods is a policy fellow for regulations at Americans for Prosperity. Clint previously served as the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Air and Radiation at the United States Environmental Protection Agency, as Executive Director for the Association of Air Pollution Control Agencies, and in senior positions with the U.S. House Science Committee, American Legislative Exchange Council, and the Recreation Vehicle Industry Association. Nick Loris is the Deputy Director of Heritage's Thomas Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies. Nick is an economist, and as Heritage's Herbert and Joyce Morgan Fellow, he focuses on energy, environmental, and regulatory issues. He is a prolific contributor to the Daily Signal, which is Heritage's multimedia news organization, and Nick is the lead author on the study that forms the framework for today's conversation. Moderating today's conversation is Tim Descher, Associate Director of Coalition Relations at Heritage. Tim has a deep background across policy issues, economic and regulatory, and he's built that here at Heritage, in governor's offices, on presidential campaigns, and in the White House. Many of you will recognize his name and his voice as he is the co-host of our popular Heritage Explains podcast. We're pleased to have all of you with us today, and I now turn the conversation over to Tim.
Well, Andy, thank you so much. So everybody, again, thank you so much for tuning in. It means the world on a Friday. The idea for this event started after a podcast that Nick Loris and I did a few weeks ago. Andy came to me and said, hey, we got to do this as an event. It was really good. And so when the boss says move, you move. So Nick has done a great job compiling this report called Restoring America as the Land of the Free. And that goes through ways of improving our score in the Index of Economic Freedom. And so anybody who doesn't know what the index is, that's a way that Heritage measures how all countries around the world are doing in terms of their economic freedom. And they have various different ways of scoring. But really what this report does is it plays off of the scores the US received, and it prescribes ways that we can move toward greater freedom. So Nick, I'm gonna just kick it off to you really quick. Can you just give us just a little bit more of the genesis of this report and putting it together?
Yeah, sure, and thank you all for being here. The genesis of this report really stems from marrying two concepts that Heritage has done for a very long time. The first being our Index of Economic Freedom, which we've compiled for more than 25 years now, that objectively measures a country's freedom score based on a wide range of different factors, whether that's government spending or business investment or trade freedom, private property rights, all of the hallmarks that we know present strong linkages to higher levels of prosperity. The second concept for this report is providing policy recommendations for members of Congress, for state legislators, so we can improve our score. A lot of what Heritage has done through its issue briefs and its backgrounders is to provide recommendations for Congress on a wide range of public policy issues. And so I've always been amazed when the Heritage releases our Index of Economic Freedom, and it's just flooded with international reporters, folks from embassies. We get calls from around the world saying, how can we improve our score? They measure themselves next to their neighbors. They see it as a benchmark achievement when they move up in the rankings. And the genesis for this report is, how can we create that same sense of pride and urgency for US policymakers to adopt the right policy reforms that not only improve the US score, but also give people a better standard of living for all Americans.
Yeah, Nick, like everything, there are things that we do well, and then there are things that we really need to improve on. Can you briefly just give us some of the good and the bad news?
Yeah, well, it's probably no surprise that the worst score that we have is our government spending and fiscal health. Being so far in debt, it has just tanked the score in a way that has taken us from the free category to mostly free. And so if you back up a little bit, in 2006, we were in the free category, which is any score above an 80. We continually slid down into the mostly free category in 2010, and then just kind of continued to downslide. And so this policy prescription for fiscal health and government spending is critical to boosting the score by trying to implement spending caps, trying to get our fiscal house in order. But then there's also marginal improvements that we can make in areas that we do historically well on. We have historically strong private property rights in the United States, but we don't adequately compensate private property owners for regulatory takings. We have a number of regulations that can potentially seize activity on private property. And so whether we're doing well in certain categories versus others, I think what's special about this report is there's still a laundry list of improvements to make for all of these categories.
Yeah, Senator Fan, first of all, it's such an honor to have you here. I know all the hard work that you do in the state of Arizona to make it a freer, more prosperous place to live. There's a natural tension between private and public sector, as we know. So as the president of the Arizona State Senate and also a business owner, can you just talk just a little bit about fighting that natural tension and the potential that states have to increase our economic freedom through doing that?
Great, thank you. One of the stories that we know here in Arizona is when I started my business 35 years ago, I started with $500 out of my house. We are now the largest guardrail company in the state of Arizona. And one of the reasons why we were successful is because the lack of regulation, or reduced regulation, if you will, and overburdening government interference 35 years ago. We have seen that eroded over the last 3 decades. If I were to try and start my business now, I could not do it. But I can tell you, we have an amazing governor who has just started his second term. We have a very fiscally conservative legislative body, and we are turning that back around in Arizona. Arizona is one of the leading states in the nation for fiscal responsibility, great business opportunities, and low taxes. We are constantly being held up by ALEC and the Cato Institute, as well as the Heritage Foundation, about the great policies that we are doing here in Arizona. Last year, in simplifying our tax code, we cut personal income taxes by reducing the number of total brackets from 5 to 4. And we cut those tax rates for nearly every person in those brackets. Arizona saved income earners about $680 million in fiscal year 2020. That tax liability was compared to the federal conformity baseline. We are one of the fastest growing states because of our pro-business policies. We have many, many California companies moving here to get away from that over-regulation, over-taxation. Companies like Intel, Amazon, national companies like insurance, national insurance company. They are all coming to Arizona.
Yeah, it's truly incredible when you see, especially if you look at one of the rankings, the ALEC Rich States, Poor States. Arizona has consistently risen in that, and it's because of work like that that you're doing, applying some of these prescriptions that we have in the report. Now, one of those things is regulatory reform, and I'm going to move to Clint because he has done a lot of work on that. He's been at all different levels of the government process. And there's been some recent developments in regulatory reform through the Trump administration. And we know that the administration's efforts have driven a lot of meaningful economic growth recently. So in the wake of COVID, we have seen some movement, additional movement in regulatory reform. What could this mean for our recovery, Clint?
Well, Tim, thanks so much for having me, and let me commend Heritage and Nick for this report. I think folks, are well aware of the value of the Index of Economic Freedom, and like any good report card, it helps to lead the way to reforms that are necessary, and I think really hones in on some of those key public policy topics. I have had the privilege of serving as a regulator and representing regulators at state and federal level of government, and I think there's some exciting things happening. I think COVID-19 represents a really unique inflection point for the state of regulatory reform for Americans for Prosperity, which is a grassroots organization with more than 3 million activists around the country working across our 35 state chapters to really effectuate change at the state and federal level. And we see a lot of interaction between those efforts. So in the same ways that are very broad federal regulations like the Clean Air Act or Clean Water Act are ultimately implemented at the state level, we also are seeing right now ill-advised arguments for bailouts of state and local governments that have recklessly spent for decades. And we strongly believe that those bailouts should be rejected. I think similarly, we've seen some really creative solutions in places like Arizona that need to be tiered up at the federal level. I think as we've looked at COVID-19, it's revealed a few things about our regulatory system and really highlighted some opportunities and challenges. I think one is that in many states we're seeing a very expansive view of executive authority in the form of lockdown orders and other actions that really reveal just how powerful our state and federal government can be in a state of emergency. I also think it has revealed, and as our colleagues at the Competitive Enterprise Institute has put it, that many of our regulations are not only getting in the way of a response to COVID-19, but also may have been never needed in the first place. And I think folks are beginning to see the ways that accumulated red tape holds us back in this country. I also think folks are rightfully more skeptical than any time in my lifetime, at least, about the role and the ways in which government makes science-based decision making, and how they implement regulations based upon significant uncertainty and consideration of risk. And I think folks are asking questions and looking for ways to reduce red tape, ways to be more nimble, ways to reduce the regressive effects of regulation that impact the least fortunate among us. I think this crisis has really revealed the ways in which those regulations drive up housing and energy and transportation and food costs for those at the bottom of our economic rung. And I think there's a real opportunity to explore those things. And there's been an interesting conversation, I think, prompted by COVID-19 that I think the answer also answers the question of how do we restore America's place as the land of the free? And it's what is the problem and why can't we build stuff in America anymore? Mark Anderson from Silicon Valley wrote in what shouldn't have been a very provocative essay a few weeks back, that question, and whether it's skyscrapers or roads and bridges or wind turbines or vaccines or hospital beds, there's a lot of red tape at all levels of government and a lot of tools for those that want to keep us from growing and keep us from being economically free that I think at AFP we see as one of the highest priorities for a stronger recovery and for an opportunity for us to build a more resilient economy.
Yeah, thank you, Clint. Nick, I want to jump back to you real quick. Give us a little more sense you went through the places where we're down, where we're up, but I want to focus on, and now especially with the CARES Act that we passed, the trillions of dollars that we're spending here. Can you just put into context for us what that means for taxpayers, what that means for legislators around the country and states? Just put that in context a little bit more for us.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think you're seeing really two competing theories here. The first is kind of what Clint mentioned, and that's where are regulatory burdens that may have shouldn't have ever been there in the first place gotten in the way of an immediate recovery, but also sustaining an economic recovery. And so that's been really encouraging to see. The Americans for Tax Reform put out a laundry list of everything that the federal government and the states have done to waive regulations to save lives and save livelihoods in a lot of senses. But then there's a lot of posturing for the never let a crisis go to waste mantra, to how can we secure funds for our own benefit. And you've seen that through the CARES package already. You've seen that through the $3 trillion proposed HEROES package from the House Democrats. And a lot of times the failing here is not to keep people tethered to their jobs, but instead, how can we use the political process to gain well after the pandemic and the immediate crisis is over. And so not only will that add potentially trillions, if not more, to the federal debt, but it will just continue to increase the government's involvement in that are best left for the private sector. We've seen this in the energy and environment landscape, where I work on primarily as an issue area focus, where there were talks of extending the wind production tax credit and the solar investment tax credit years beyond what they were initially intended for. And there's a difference, a very stark difference between helping those companies who have been impacted by supply chain disruptions or the demand side effects of the pandemic versus implementing these policies that will last long after the pandemic is over. And so I think that's hopefully what this report continues to build off of, is warning folks of the immediate economic costs, both in terms of costs to taxpayers, but also cost to government intervention into the economy, like we saw with the Obama stimulus plan, where there was a lot of money that was doled out for green energy, but also how can we fix those regulatory barriers even more so to capitalize on people wanting to get back to work. When small businesses are having a hard time becoming entrepreneurs because of the lending processes at the SEC, or looking at tax reform, and we saw some progress with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, but how can we make immediate expensing so businesses can deduct their costs in the year that they were incurred well beyond when it expires in a few years through TCJA. That is a huge part of this process that will encourage new investment and innovation, rather than allowing the government to dictate who builds what and how and when. That's really at the heart of the discussion right now. And I think as we turn to from crisis mode to recovery mode, I'm very wary of this stimulus style approach that we've seen in the past, that both Republicans and Democrats can be susceptible to falling for, because they can bring a lot of that money back to their state and back to that district. And it really creates this vicious loop of politicians and lobbyists determining who gets the benefit. And there's a tremendous opportunity cost to all of that, because businesses that don't get a chunk of that money are left out.
Thanks, Nick. I want to invite everybody, if you have a question, I know this is a smart audience, anybody who's tuning in here probably has some questions. So please go to the control panel. You can type in a question and we'll get to that coming up. Senator Fenn, I wanted to move back to you, because I'm so fascinated with your experience, kind of living with both feet, one in the private, one in the public sector at the same time. So it's kind of a broader question, but I think you'll be able to get the gist of it. What do you see as the biggest impediment from the federal government in helping you do your job as the state Senate president?
Great question. I'd like to make a note, something that Nick said about never let a crisis go to waste. We are already working on our special session to get rid of some of that stuff to get us moving back together. So Nick, you're right on point with that one. So as far as the federal government, now my business is a highway construction business. So that's pretty much 98% of my work is federal highway work. And you probably are aware, but those of you who may not be, we have so much government regulation dealing with highway work. Obviously, you know, we of course need to be safe with OSHA and making sure that we are providing a good product, but the environmental requirements have just gotten out of control here. The cost to the taxpayers has just risen, the per mile cost in construction, just because of all of those regulations, the CFRs, the work requirements, all of those things that has now taken us thousands and thousands of dollars and tens and millions of dollars. That is all government regulation instead of it going into more jobs and into the project.
Tell me more about your biggest challenge from the federal government when it comes to being a business owner. You might have covered just a little bit that, but go a little deeper on that.
Okay, yeah, again, I'm going deeper in the fact that the paperwork, the mounds and mounds of paperwork that we have to do by the way of certified payrolls, by the way of all the HR stuff. You know, when we work on a reservation, we are required to hire a certain number of tribal members, which is great, but these are federal highways. But we are required to do that, which means that now I either have to lay off my own employees or I end up with too many people on the job because I'm required to hire a certain percentage of the tribal members. And when I do, many of them are great workers and I'm thrilled to have them stay on and work with my company and go to other job sites. But consequently, they don't have to leave their nations. And so my unemployment goes up because they all get to file unemployment on me now. So there's just all these nuances that keep going with the regulation that is just totally ridiculous. And like I said, the environmental stuff that we have to do now, as far as, you know, just making sure that there is, you know, we put up orange fencing now to make sure that the desert turtles don't cross the road during construction. But when there's no construction going on, there's no orange fence, and the desert turtles are still crossing the road. So those are kind of things. The new Kingman overpass, we've literally had to spend $1.5 million for a special overpass so that some of the animals could get from one side to the other instead of going down to where the other cross was. So just, you know, a lot of government ifs, ands, and whats.
No kidding. Hey, Clint, I'm curious from your sense, you know, you guys represent, you know, millions of people, millions of grassroots activist people. From your job as a policy person, I'm wondering what has worked in communicating some of the urgency of these problems. Do you find that some messaging works better? Do you find that some, you know, messaging you should probably forget about doing? How do we engage people who are truly interested in being activists?
No, Tim, that's a great question. I think and in the issues that I've worked on, which tend to get pretty weedy when you're talking about, you know, air quality regulation and some of the more detailed and elaborate and often can take up thousands of pages in the Federal Register type of rules, it's tough to engage, you know, activist community that I think has instincts in the right directions. I think this report does a really good job of it, helping get back to first principles and concepts of how can we remove barriers to economic opportunity. That really fit within our grassroots engagement model. I think we've found tremendous value, and actually I think some of the examples that have been cited already are right within this to really illustrate the ways in which red tape and regulation at the state, local, and federal level can impact the lives of individuals and impact people in your community and cause what ultimately are unintended consequences. I think we see for many of these regulations, not only do they have that regressive impact, they also are often supported by some in the business community and the regulated community as a way to keep new entrants out. So that I think covers things like occupational licensing, in which you may have additional regulation for a sector designed to keep other people from joining that profession. And I know Arizona and others have been leading the way on those efforts. I think similarly, I think as you look across different types of regulation, you see, and highway construction is a perfect example of this, but I think—
Wait, Clint, let me just interrupt you there. Sorry, I just want to make sure we've got this, that everybody in the audience gets this. Occupational licensing, and I saw Senator Fan shake her head and smile because it's a big, they've worked a lot on that. Just briefly explain what that means, how states can be a part of that, how the federal government can be a part of that, just what occupational licensing is. Appreciate that.
Sure, and I want to give credit because I think there is a great effort underway with our folks who are focused on labor and employment issues. The White House has an initiative on this front, and I think there's a number of states that have been proactive identifying occupational licensing as a high priority and ultimately a really critical barriers for individuals improving their lot in life. And ultimately, these requirements often emanate from the state level and require everyone from a florist to a funeral director to a lawyer to get various certifications, requirements, and training, and often don't recognize when someone moves across state lines the experience and expertise that they've developed perhaps in a different state. And so we've seen a lot of innovation that way, and I think COVID-19 has helped to illustrate this, where really nonsensical requirements that keep voluntary medical professionals who are trying to be first responders in a state where they may not have been licensed in the first instance have been waved away in a number of states. And so we think that progress should be extended, and questions should be asked. If you want to run a hair braiding company out of your home, should you need a specific business permit that may be restricted? And if you want to practice forestry or floristry rather, and grow flowers and sell them, and you've developed skills in that way that may not have been recognized by the strict board that oversees florists in your state, does that make a lot of sense? Doesn't that hold back our economy? And so we see tremendous opportunity and a whole lot of progress, and a lot of groups in center right that have done, I think, a ton to connect the dots on that. And really, I think it's surprising to most people just how much red tape there is to break into a new profession in their community.
Yeah, Senator Fan, weigh in on that a little bit. What was some of the work that I think it was recently, you passed some occupational licensing reform within the state of Arizona. Have you seen some results from that?
Absolutely. We keep doing more and more every year. So obviously the things, as was mentioned, the braiding in the home, the florist, hair blow dry shops, all of those things, there's no reason for them to have licenses. They're not dealing with chemicals. They're not dealing with anything that would remotely require a license of any kind. If you're an electrician in New Mexico, then you might as well be an electrician in Arizona. You don't need to have another license here. I am looking forward to the day where we can actually just have one universal electrical license throughout the United States, so they can take that license wherever they end up going, whether it's temporary or permanently. We also, we are doing a lot of things with our military. As you know, we have quite a few military bases here in Arizona, and we encourage our military families to stay here and to move here. And they have all gotten out of the service with some really, really great skills, whether it's in construction or tech or anything. And so we're recognizing those years of experience they have and waiving those, not only the licensing for it, but the licensing fees for them as well.
That's fantastic. We're going to move to questions from the audience. Thank you so much for submitting. If you want to submit, if you have something that sparked your interest, please feel free. You can see how to do that in the chat box there. We're going to go to Stu Reuter. He's a tax preparer in D.C., and he asked the question that Senator Cruz and Senator Lee addressed at a similar webinar to this earlier this week. And I'm going to toss it up there. Nick, maybe Clint, you could do this, and also Senator Fan. Whoever jumps in first gets the first answer. How are we going to keep all the regs that have been waived recently from COVID from being reimposed? Now, I think that's a great question. So that's a free one.
I'll jump in. Make sure Republicans get reelected, please.
And I'd add, I think there's it's a great question. And while I've spent most of my life trying to avoid people who do taxes in DC, I think there's several ideas out there. So last week, President Trump issued an executive order on regulatory relief and economic recovery that among, I think, the three major provisions asked federal agencies to find ways to permanently rescind those regulations that may have been demonstrated to not make sense in a crisis and probably don't make sense when this is all over. We've also seen legislation introduced by folks like Representative Andy Biggs from Arizona and Chip Roy from Texas to require that those rules and regulations that have been suspended during this pandemic are done so permanently unless Congress passes a law to reinstate them. We are encouraging states to follow a similar direction as that executive order that includes not only the permanent suspension of those regulations, but leaving no stone unturned. We think there's a number of provisions at the state and federal level that haven't been fully tapped. For example, many of the barriers to highway construction that Senator Fan had mentioned are under various statutes and implementing regulations that have provisions that allow for waiving the National Environmental Protection Act, or excuse me, Policy Acts reviews, or certain requirements of Davis-Bacon for prevailing wage requirements for highway construction projects, or the National Historic Preservation Act requirements for historic preservation reviews. And we think those federal agencies and state agencies should go further in identifying that red tape that may continue to keep us not only from responding to COVID, but also recovering more strongly. So we think there's a lot in that executive order worth taking a close look at.
Nick, anything?
Yeah, I'll just quickly add that, my hope is that the tangible experiences that people have seen with the obstacles these regulations have presented have actually questioned the need for the regulations. I think generally people may think that regulations are good. They protect public health, they protect safety, and certainly some regulations are necessary. But this reminds me kind of the debate when Uber and Lyft were first happening and really taking off the ground, and you saw all of these cities and areas kind of cater to the taxi lobbies and prohibit Uber from operating in their states or prohibiting Lyft from operating in their cities. And people were saying, why? This is competition. This has been good for me. I'm hoping the same will be happening with a lot of these regulatory reforms. The National Environmental Policy Act that Clint mentioned is a great example. If you look back during the Obama administration and their stimulus bill, I think one of the quotes from President Obama at the time was, these shovel-ready jobs weren't as shovel-ready as we anticipated because of something like NEPA. And you have to wonder if something, for over 100,000 different projects going on across the country, if NEPA is being waived 90% of the time, why do we have that process in the first place? And again, this is something that not just affects our public roads and the highways, but things like solar and renewable projects as well. It was the wind industry and the solar industry who are really behind this administration when it came to implementing some sort of NEPA reform. My only fear is that with all of the people who have given themselves haircuts during the pandemic, it's going to set occupational licensing back 10 years.
That's a good thought, actually. Yeah. We have another question from our audience, and Nick, thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. This is from James Plant. How can we control federal COVID-19 state funding from being misused at a state level to pay down debt not associated with COVID-19, i.e. municipal retirement obligations, pensions? We all know the quote unquote bailout scenario. So again, maybe Senator Fan, you have an idea on this, but I'll throw it out to anybody as well.
Okay, I'll start in with this one. Obviously, the monies that came directly from the federal government to the states, we have some say over that. There are some regulations about what we can and can't do. It is a little open-ended in the sense that the way it's outlined, because of everything we do on a municipality or a state level, it's a matter is, do you pay it and backfill it, or do you do it directly? It's a great question, and I think it's going to be up to fiscally responsible governors and legislative bodies to be able to keep a handle on that and make sure that we use those monies wisely.
And Tim, I'd just add, if you don't mind, I think, American for Prosperity strongly believes that we should reject those bailouts of state and local governments that have recklessly spent and created a giant hole. And I say this as a former pensioner in Kentucky, who one of the states that is in the biggest hole. And I also will say, I think some of the reactions to COVID-19, if you really want to see a parade of horrible ideas, Nancy Pelosi's most recent legislation responds to what I think are legitimate concerns about the underlying drivers of things like housing unaffordability, with a magnitude of money and red tape that is ridiculous. So we know that several million people are evicted from their homes each year, and that there are problems. We actually have been fairly surprised, and I think it's a signal of just how much the housing market, whether it be between landlords and tenants or homeowners and lenders, is built on relationships of mutual benefit, that not that many people fewer paid their rent in May of 2020 compared to May of 2019, and actually purchase rate lock activity is higher. In spite of that, and in spite of what we think is a consensus that the underlying driver of housing unaffordability is closed access cities like San Francisco and Seattle that enact prohibitive policies and land use and zoning barriers that keep us from building the housing supply to put people in affordable and diverse housing. Instead, Nancy Pelosi's recommendation is over $200 billion in housing assistance. So just to put that in perspective, in 2019, only $500 billion was spent in all of rent in the entire United States for housing assistance that is untargeted. And similarly, nationwide moratoria on evictions and foreclosures, as well as policies to prevent any negative consumer credit reporting. We think all of those actions move in the wrong direction instead of pursuing the economic freedoms that are recommended, I think, in this report to respond what is an underlying housing crisis. More red tape and more spending is not the answer.
And it's funny you should say that, Clint. A very, very free rated country in the Index of Economic Freedom, New Zealand, they have seen firsthand what a federal government, what they would be the big government there, trying to fix a housing problem in Auckland. It's completely failed, and it's only resulted in less housing, less freedom, less opportunity. So that is not the way. It's clear as an example, clear as a bell there in New Zealand. So maybe we should send that example to Speaker Pelosi as well. Nick, I had a question here, and this is from the boss, Andy Olivastra. So I have to ask it, or else I'll probably be in the doghouse, Andy. He said there's 11 chapters in your report, and we consider that a blueprint. We really do. What's one or two of the areas or the chapters that don't get as much attention? I know we talked about the debt and spending and things like that, but what are some of the ones that we wouldn't necessarily expect or hear from?
Yeah, I'll give you two. The first is trade freedom. This is something that hasn't been discussed all too much today, but has obviously been a big topic of conversation with this administration. And again, something where tariff payments have been waived. You're asking if they've been waived during a time of crisis, why do we have these tariffs in the first place? And some of the knee-jerk responses to the oil crisis and the plummeting of oil prices was to implement a tariff on imported oil, which would have been disastrous to U.S. refineries. If you look at the open markets in oil extraction and refining processes, it's not just benefited the shale producers and the domestic producers in the United States, but also the refineries who in the Gulf Coast are better equipped to refine the heavier sour crudes coming from places like Canada or the Middle East or places like Mexico. So implementing tariffs or any type of Buy American provisions would have been troubling for the refining industry, but most importantly for consumers through higher prices. And it wouldn't have really moved the needle in terms of boosting oil prices to a sustainable level for a lot of producers. So trade freedom is very important, especially I think in this time where economic freedom has come under attack from both the left and the right in some senses, and this promotion of economic nationalism has gained attention. That was part of the other genesis for this report, is to say that we're not interested in economic freedom just for freedom's sake or just for getting a better score on the report card. Yes, freedom is vitally important, but it's also just to promote higher levels of prosperity and better lives for all Americans. So trade freedom is important. And then investment freedom is something that probably doesn't get a ton of attention unless you are a business or an investor, but it is critical to driving innovation and investment in the United States. And we have a lot of antiquated, unnecessary laws in place that prohibit foreign investment, for instance. If you look at something esoteric like the Foreign Dredge Act, which has been in law for more than a century now, it prohibits dredging in the United States at U.S. ports. It prohibits foreign companies from bidding on those projects. And what that results in is much higher expenses because most of the best dredgers in the world come from the Netherlands, come from Belgium, who can do these types of activities twice as fast and at a fraction of the cost. And that would just open up more economic opportunity at the U.S. ports, who now are forced to light load their cargo because the ports aren't deep enough, and so they have to offload it in Canada and then bring it down to the United States. Or there's a lot of congestion at the ports where they can only let a certain amount of ships in at a certain amount of time, and so ships are effectively just waiting to get into the port entry for a week or two at a time, and that just slows all sorts of economic activity, not just for products coming into the United States, but also for products being exported out of the United States to consumers. It's our farmers who are really impacted by things like this. So to trade freedom and investment freedom, I think are two areas where we can continue to grow. We can obviously continue to improve our score, but it will really help kind of jumpstart and sustain an economic recovery.
Senator Fan, and just wrapping us up, go ahead and just give us kind of key takeaways that you want folks to have from Arizona. What can you impart on us as we wrap this up?
Well, we are in a battle here. We are a right to work state. We want to keep it that way. We know that the outside forces are trying to push very hard this year in our elections to turn us not only into a blue state, but a union state. So we are pushing back very, very hard on that, because that's one of our main reasons for success here is we are a right to work state. We also make sure that we're fiscally responsible. When we talk about that, the rest of that COVID money, not only as an executive board member on ALEC, but as well as the Senate president, we said no to that $3 trillion. We don't need to put our country in debt anymore. We saved our money. We have over $1 billion in our rainy day fund. We put aside another $700 million just to take care of this COVID stuff out of our own pocket. So that's what states need to do. We need to be more responsible, and that just the debt, the union and public safety debt, we have got to take care of that, because that is just getting us deeper and deeper in a hole, and we have got to figure out how to fix that nationwide.
Yeah, thank you so much, Senator Fan. Really appreciate it. Clint, why don't you go ahead and wrap us up with your final thoughts too?
Great. Well, thanks again for having me. And I think this has been a really, really helpful conversation. I think, in thinking about the inflection point that we're at with COVID-19 and with the response, and I think a lot of the reactions that folks who are rightfully in favor of economic freedom have had. I think our organization, I think many had an initial reaction of let's do no harm. Let's keep the state and federal governments from not doing anything worse, and let's be timely and targeted and temporary was kind of our motto. And I think there's a number of reasons, and I think this report really helps to transition that conversation. It is not Rahm Emanuel style crisis opportunism to say we need to have a principled, stronger economic recovery, and part of that is taking a very close look up and down all levels of government and how can we remove barriers to economic opportunity, and how can we do things smarter and allow us to build again in America. And I think this report really helps to lead us in that direction, and hopefully in a way that not only avoids those bad deals that we keep getting pitched, but also leads us to seriously look at things from energy and environmental regulation to labor requirements to occupational licensing to highway construction requirements to the many categories of red tape that we see across our economic system, and hopefully to raise us all up to be stronger in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much, Clint, for being a part of this, and take care of my adopted home state of Ohio, okay? Hey, Nick, I want to end with you with this. You quote Milton Friedman in the paper, and you say, The quote says, quote, "The market gives people what the people want instead of what other people think they ought to want." At the bottom of many criticisms of the market economy is really lack of belief in freedom itself, end quote. And you talk about the connection between economic freedom and societal improvement being unmistakable. As you wrap up, just talk a little bit more about that, because it was so inspiring on the podcast. I want to let our audience hear that as well.
Yeah, well, thanks, Tim, and again, thanks, Clint and Senator Fan. I mean, two people who have dedicated their work to improving people's lives at different levels of government, and so we all owe a debt of gratitude to the two of them, not just for being here today, but for their work. I pulled that quote because if you look at the link between economic freedom and human flourishing, it really is unmistakable. That linkage is very strong in terms of allowing people the opportunities to pursue their dreams, to produce the goods and services that people want and demand, to reducing levels of poverty, of unemployment, to improving the environment. There's a strong linkage between economic freedom and environmental prosperity. So all of the things that we desire collectively as a society, but also on an individual basis, economic freedom gives us that. And the other quote that I really like, but I use too often, comes from Friedrich Hayek, is that the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to man how little they know about what they imagine they can design. And a lot of times policymakers think they can design what the economy should look like, but end up failing miserably. And when you empower the humans' ability to do that, you just see so much success in terms of innovation and bright new ideas, but also just raising levels of prosperity so people have the opportunity to do more and be a better society.
Well, thank you so much, Nick. And as our panelists exit stage left, wherever that is, we're going to kick it back to Andy Olivastro.
Thank you, Tim, very much. Thank you, everyone, for this wonderful conversation. The theme that resonated throughout: freedom and flourishing. And I would say, I challenge our audience. Senator Fan is an inspiration. I challenge our audience: who's the next Honorable Karen Fan? Who's a leader in the legislature who also started a flourishing business with $500 out of their own home? It's truly remarkable what you can do in America. Thank you, Senator Fan. Thank you, Clint Woods, for your comments and for the work you do. Thank you to Nick and Tim for helping lead this conversation and helping us at Heritage shape this conversation nationally. Thank everyone for joining us, for all the questions. It's hard to get to all of them. Feel free to email Tim or myself. I'm at andrew.olivastro@heritage.org. We appreciate the ongoing feedback that we receive from all of you. And please visit resourcebank.org and heritage.org for these recordings and for upcoming programs. And now let's all go do our part and restore America as the land of the free.